McDonald, and welcome to my next vlog. For this one, I was going to continue on directly from the last vlog, which was the story of the first part of the early days of my transitioning, my realizing I was transgender and the steps I began to take. But there's another question that's related to very closely to realizing I'm transgender and taking steps to transition. And that question is, am I, as a trans woman, am I a woman? What do I identify as? Am I a trans woman? That question of what am I identifying as and what am I? And the difference turns out to be more than just of academic interest, because a lot of people who are anti-trans, transphobic as the word that's used, often say because we're only identifying as, then somehow it's a choice. This question also arises in respect of people who are ABDL, and for that matter, just about any other form of identity. But bring this back to being transgender, the answer for me is I am a transgender woman. I'm a trans woman. In a gender binary world, in a gender binary context, I identify as a woman. The one thing I'm certainly not is male. Again, hang on. No, I've taken my anatomy model into the other room. As you've seen in a couple of my earlier videos of my anatomy model, I am a human who has both breasts and a penis. So, one I was born with, one I developed by taking estrogen hormones. So the question's not irrelevant. I identify as a transgender woman because that's what I am. To say I am a woman in some contexts there's not enough information in there. While people who study these sort of questions realize that there's no one characteristic, particularly for women, who that applies to every person who is identified at birth as female. There's no one characteristic. Like, there are women who are genetically women, who are identified at birth as women based on their genitalia at that point, who it's found they don't have a uterus, for example. And in that case, they won't menstruate. And, are they women? Well, that's not for me to say. But this is where the question arises. Not all women have periods. Not all women give birth. Not all women. Some women have small breasts. Some women have big breasts. They're just examples off the top of my head. As I said, these are not scripted videos, and I don't have every single thought on the topic, carried around in my brain. But these examples show that people who are seen by society as women, people who see themselves as women, don't have every single characteristic in common, and that's normal for any category. There's things that are I'm saying category, I'm not dehumanizing or anything, women, or dehumanizing men or whatever. I'm just saying in general terms, any group of something, there's always a set of characteristics that is typical of that group, but there's always members of that group for whom at least some of those characteristics are not the case. And that's what our research, the people who study these sort of matters, that's what they've realised. So for me to say I am a woman, yeah, I can definitely claim that. I'm quite happy to claim that, because I have a brain that wants to see me as female, or else my transitioning would have just led to misery. So I have a brain that wants to see me as female. I've grown breasts that are very typically female, not very large, but they are typical female. And so I see the world as a woman. I just can't relate to the world, through male eyes. The male world just makes no sense to me. So for these reasons, and for the reason that it works for me, my world makes sense seeing myself as a woman, saying I am a woman. But in saying I am a woman, say particularly in a medical situation, that implies that I have a female reproductive system, which I don't. And so that's a key issue. It also loses sight or makes invisible the reality that I have a prostate gland, which is a very typical, male organ to have. So this is why I identify as a woman rather than saying I am a woman. But in practical terms, practical day-to-day terms, I am a woman. I use female pronouns. I get offended if male pronouns are used. Usually people don't mean anything by it. They just look at my face and they see male and hence use male pronouns and so forth. So most of the time I don't get worried by it, but every so often I realise that somebody's calling me sir or what have you, because quite frankly they're trying to be offensive. And sometimes I will say something, and sometimes I will just walk away and feel angry about it and internalize that anger, which is not a good thing to do. So yeah, so that's why I identify as a woman, because I don't want to take away from the very real experiences of cisgendered women. That's women who are identified at birth as women and whose brains and so on see themselves as women. And cisgendered women have, I've done a lot of reading. I've read the experiences of cisgendered women, particularly in terms of their matters related to reproduction, but also in matters of just socially being treated as second-class citizens in a largely patriarchal Western world. And yeah, I was born with patriarchal privilege. There's I can't really go into them off the top of my head, but I'm mindful of the fact that I was born being seen as a male, and society, granted me, certain privileges and power because of that relative to women. And that's something that was outside of my control. It was something that for a large part of my life I wasn't even aware of. So if you're not aware of something, you can't do much about it. But certainly in my reading of women's experiences, there's a hell of a lot that women have gone through and go through that I just haven't had to touch base with. Um, in my working career in railways in Sydney, when women began to become parts of members of, began to be employed in train crewing, which was up until my memory was very much an all male. When I joined train crewing in Sydney, I I was living as a male. I was kind of seeing myself as a male. I hadn't fully realised I was transgender, and so I remember when train crewing was all male, and speaking to the first women who began to be employed in train crewing, their toilets, for example, was little more than the broom closet fitted out with a toilet. Um, Quite frankly, it was horrible. There was just no. It was disrespectful. It was probably in some ways not even particularly clean. Um, by an overgrown broom closet, I mean I'm talking about where the mops and buckets were stored, where the cleaning supplies were stored. It was not what you would expect of a toilet. Um, and that's something that's always stuck in my mind. It took a while for the facilities, the train crewing facilities, to be brought up to up to par for equality between men and women in train crew. Um, that's just that's just one perhaps not realised example. Um, I don't know what it's like to experience a menstrual cycle and the and the cramps that go along with that, the pain that goes along with that for many women. Um, I really have trouble imagining having to worry about period leaks, coming through on your clothing and stuff. Um, there's been a couple of few times I've used food colouring to on a pad to simulate what it might feel like to have a period. I know it's a very poor simulation, but there's been at least one or two occasions where I've gone a bit overboard with the food colouring, and I've been out and about, and I have wondered, have I gone overboard and created a leak? I don't think I did, but that's the closest I've got to being concerned about that. And when I try and imagine what that's like, every month for a large portion of your life, having to think about that, having to, I have enough trouble keeping track of doctor's appointments and paying bills, let alone keeping track of something which, like, bleeding every month, and having to manage that so that I don't cause any a difficulty for myself or for the people around me. And often, the difficulty is, to be quite honest, in other people's attitudes. Society says that women shall not be seen to be menstruating. Um, a lot of the advertising for period products is about minimising, preventing leakages. Um, how dare the rest of the world know that you're having a period because you've leaked or something? And that's, quite frankly, that's the rest of the world's problem. None of us like to, we all like to be, clean and presentable. None of us like to, for example, spill coffee down our shirt and things like that. We don't go out dressed with stained clothing, whatever the cause of the stain. So, you know, but on the other hand, if you see somebody with coffee spilled on them, then yeah, okay, it's probably no big deal. But if you see somebody with blood on them, it's like, oh dear, what's going on here? Well, that's the impression that I have from the material that I've read and so on, and all that is something I've just never had to touch base with. I've never had to go through a gynecological exam. I've never had to have a pelvic exam. You know, I don't know. These are just the things that most immediately come to mind. I have no doubt there's other issues. I remember after I transitioned and was living 24/7 as a woman, um, I would, because my shifts were often late night finishes and so on, I'd be walking across the park near where I lived at the time, and I realised that I was more vulnerable as a woman doing that walk at night than I felt as a male doing that walk at night. And that realization was quite confronting. It wasn't that I experienced any real danger, but it was the thought. I found myself paying more attention to people around me. If there was anybody around me, I found myself paying more attention to the shadows. Was there anybody hiding in the shadows? It was, yeah, as I said, it was really confronting, and it brought home to me just what cisgendered women have to cope with in our society. Um, so yeah, that sort of says, yeah, I've certainly experienced life now through the eyes of a woman. So I'm more than happy to identify as a woman. Um, but as I've explained, to say I am a woman, it leaves out part of the story. Um, it it just, yeah. So that's why I say I identify as a woman, but I am a transgender woman. Whether, fortunately, I live in a society in which I can safely say I identify as I am a transgender woman. Um, I'm not really likely to find myself killed for saying I'm a transgender woman. I'm very thankful for that. Um, that Yeah, that's what I am. Just if in a medical situation, um, if I say to a doctor I am a transgender woman, as long as they're up to speed with their research, they'll realise that they're dealing with a body that has some femaleness to it, but it also has maleness to it as well. Um, Men can certainly get breast cancer, but it is largely a female issue. It's an issue that women have to deal with more generally than men do. And I certainly have breasts that are capable of getting breast cancer. I also have a penis that is capable of getting cancers associated with, testes, and I think you can have cancer of the penis as well. Certainly prostate cancer. And doctors need to be aware of this when they're doing medical exams and so on, relating to me. Another interesting thing with being diagnosed with multiple sclerosis is a lot more women are diagnosed with multiple sclerosis apparently than men are. I may be wrong on this. There's a lot of detail I haven't researched, but that's what I've come across. And so I find it interesting that despite my, the maleness of my body, I've landed something that is, particularly related to women. In fact, one of the questions the doctors asked me was, how long was I still on estrogen hormone therapy, and how long I'd been on estrogen hormone therapy for. I'm not sure what conclusions they drew from that, but I have to surmise that they asked me because that was a key. There was some link between estrogen's an important hormone for women, and there's a link between that part of a woman's physiology and having multiple sclerosis. So that's kind of what I wanted to say on identifying as versus saying I am. Look, people can say they are whatever they like, but there's two. Broadly speaking, there's two parts to our identity, or our various identities. People can have multiple aspects to their identity. One is how we see ourselves, our body's appearance, our body's feeling and functioning, what we feel ourselves to be, how our mind sees us. And the other broad aspect to our identity is how society sees us, how the people around us see us. An example that I'm a little bit familiar with is Indigenous identity in Australia. It's a combination of how a person sees themselves, whether they see themselves as Indigenous, but also how the Indigenous community sees them. If they've linked in to the Indigenous community, and the Indigenous community accepts them as a part of their community. But again, that's very broad. I'm painting broad brushstrokes here. I may be wrong in the details. Please don't hang, draw, and quarter me for that. I'm not trying to be offensive. I'm not trying to get it wrong. I don't know all the details. The current status of my brain just doesn't let me research and hold all the detail. But I was just as an example, broadly speaking, you've got recognition by the community, by the people around us, and you've got self-identity. So the problem I face as a transgender woman is I can see myself as a transgender woman, but it doesn't mean, and I really can't force people around me to see me as a transgender woman or as a woman in general. That's something I haven't got much control over. Legally, they're not allowed to mistreat me for being a transgender woman. And that was, in fact, when I transitioned at work, that was basically the way my employer handled it. They went through the Anti-Discrimination Act in New South Wales at the time, and they said, yes, as a transgender woman, we're required to treat you in every way possible as a woman. The way the law was written at that time, and as far as I know, still is, was you are to be treated as your identified gender in every way practicable. So there may be some situations in which it's not practicable to treat you as a woman, but basically the onus is on that organisation, that group of people, to demonstrate why they shouldn't treat you as a woman. And one example I can think of, which I've never really tested, is women's shelters, emergency shelters, etc. Um, I probably, if I'd been, say, subject to domestic violence, um, I don't know how I'd go. I wouldn't, unless it was I really had to. I wouldn't seek help from such spaces, because quite frankly, I think it would be too confronting for cisgendered women in those spaces who had been mistreated um, in many ways quite badly by cisgendered men. And my my sense of concern for how other people feel wouldn't let me, um, you know, trigger any harm for them, trigger any difficulties for them. But fortunately, that situation never arose. But it's one that has been raised in material that I've read, and it's one I can well imagine. But certainly, as far as railways was concerned, it wasn't particularly difficult. I was, said, look, use the women's loo. In fact, the hardest bit for me with using the women's loo, a lot of the loos were mixed gender, because there wasn't room for more, at your outer depots, particularly for more than one or two cubicles. So they didn't have a urinal, for example. They just had a couple of cubicles. Um, so that wasn't an issue. But where there was a separate men's and women's toilet, it took a little while for me to begin using the women's toilets. I tended to use the toilets that were mixed gender. And it wasn't until I realised that my women colleagues accepted me on the whole as a woman that I began to feel comfortable using the women's toilet. In fact, I think I had one of them say, what's the problem? You're a woman. Use the women's loo. They were quite. One of them at least was quite blunt with me, and I got comfortable with using the women's loo, and it got to the point where I would, if another woman was in there that I was one of my colleagues I spoke to, we'd just carry on a conversation. And that, for me, that was a milestone. But it was a good example of how I didn't presume that how I saw myself as a woman was how other women that I related to, interacted with in some way, would see me. But as an employer, they weren't allowed to treat me as other than a woman. And I was very, very thankful for that. But what I can say is whether, I'll just check the timing. Oh wow, I've been nattering for 28 minutes on this. What I can say is, regardless of identifying as a woman, regardless of saying I am a transgender woman, regardless of the differences and subtleties of meaning between those two expressions, the one thing that I am is happy. There's other reasons I'm not as happy as I could be, but those reasons are not related to how I see myself as female. In fact, as soon as I realised I was transgender, and I realised that transitioning from being, living as male to living as female was what I had to do, my first response was, apart from as I've said in an earlier video, oh fuck, my next response was, wow. I was happy, and that was one of the tests if you like, that I set for myself. Was I happy with this decision to transition? Well, in some ways it wasn't a decision. It was just something I had to do. And yeah, the fact that I was happy told me that I was heading in the right direction. And the other reason, which is kind of a little bit off track for this video, was I knew that once I started hormone therapy, particularly estrogen, um, I basically lost my ability to have an erection. And from what I understand, for men, this is a very important function. And I figured that if I wasn't happy transitioning to femaleness, to being a woman, however you want to describe it, losing this function would be a problem for me. I would feel unhappy about it in some way. And to be quite honest, I just didn't care. I haven't been on hormone therapy for a number of years now, largely because the hormones had done everything that they could do physically for me. There was no additional benefit to be gained from taking hormones, taking estrogen, and for a time I was taking progesterone as well. The protective functions that estrogen and progesterone have for cisgendered women, protective functions that are lost a bit at menopause, and that's why at least some postmenopausal women actually are on hormone therapy. That role in my body is taken up by testosterone. Taking estrogen squashed my testosterone production, but without not taking estrogen means my testosterone production went back to, I'm guessing, relatively normal male levels. I haven't had my hormone levels tested for a while. Again, not medically relevant at this point. And so, yes, I am capable of enough of an erection to to masturbate, for example. And that's what my body, that's how my body orgasms. I work with what I have. What I have noticed is basically a penis is an overgrown clitoris. I've had experience with other people's, clitorises, other, other people's clitoris over the years. I have a little bit of an idea how, how that result, the link between, what's a polite word, playing with a clitoris, how that links to that person having an orgasm. I've sort of, through touch and so on, I've experienced a little bit of what that feels like for the other person. And I can say that if I, manipulate my penis in a similar way, I end up with a similar, set of feelings. And anatomically, they are more similar than, they're the same type of structure anatomically, which a lot of people I suspect aren't aware of, and which I wouldn't have thought about if I hadn't, realised I was a trans woman, and I had to focus on the physical differences and emotional and so on differences between, broadly speaking, men and women. I'm not sure how I got onto that, but so yeah, for any person, we use we gain pleasure from the way our bodies happen to be designed. Again, I'm not sure how I got onto that, but I guess there's similarities between men and women. There's differences between men and women. And our identity ties in with those similarities and differences. And really, all those similarities and differences mean is we're individuals. We're individuals some of whom have characteristics that are more typical of women, and some individuals have characteristics that are more typical of being male. And that's where I began. I say I am a transgender woman because that is the best description I have for who I am, for how my body is, for how I think, how I feel. Broadly speaking, I identify as a woman because that's how I want the world to treat me. That's how I'm most comfortable. That's how I'm happiest. And that's how I most see myself. So going forward with these videos, there's a lot of detail to discuss. I also want to do more work on my my ABDL part of my identity. I want to do some more work on my identification as a witch, some more work on my spirituality. So for anybody that finds themselves listening to this, hang in there. I think it'll be an interesting ride. Look after yourselves, be safe, and I'll see you next time.